Max was no stranger to absurdity. But nothing could have prepared him for this. One moment, he was sitting at his desk, staring at the screen, maybe distracted by an email he'd been avoiding or the slow churn of his coffee machine. The next, he was here, a white, featureless void, the kind you'd imagine existed between the pages of a forgotten science fiction novel. The air felt thick and charged with static, but eerily still. Not a breeze. Not a sound. Just him and the nothingness. Is this? Max murmured, looking down at his hands. His fingers twitched, but there was a strange lag to his movements. He felt like he was moving underwater. His palms were warm, which was at least reassuring. He was still, him, right? This had to be some kind of trick, and then, a voice. Welcome, Maxim, to the Nexus experiment. Your soul has been uploaded into the virtual continuum. The rules are simple: cooperate with the others, and you may find a way out. Fail, and, well, you'll remain here forever. Max flinched. The voice was robotic but carried a hint of amusement, like someone who knew the punchline of a joke before even telling it. He blinked, trying to process the information. He'd always been a skeptic. Was this some kind of prank? A bad dream? A hallucination from too much screen time? The voice didn't wait for an answer. Please remain calm. You are currently in a shared digital body. You will be joined by several other experimenters. Cooperation is mandatory. Max was about to shout, to demand an explanation, but then the voice continued. The body you inhabit is not yours alone. Your thoughts, your movements, your actions, everything will be shared by others in your group. Failure to cooperate will result in permanent residency in the continuum. Good luck. Max's stomach flipped. A shared body? Was that even possible? The thought alone made his brain short-circuit. He looked around again, expecting some sort of high-tech lab to appear, or a looming figure to appear and guide him through some elaborate test. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. Well, except for the figures scattered across the void. He wasn't alone, there were others. At first, he couldn't make out their details. They were blurry, like a collection of pixelated ghosts. But as they moved closer, Max began to make sense of their forms, just people. Or, at least, they looked like people. Some seemed as confused as he was, others appeared more focused, as if they already understood something he didn't. One of them, a woman, spoke up. Her voice was oddly soothing, but there was a tremor of panic underneath. What is this place? Where are we? Max stepped forward, his legs feeling strange beneath him. The world around him felt distant, like a reality that was halfway formed and never truly solid. Is this some kind of experiment? A man with a scruffy beard muttered under his breath, glancing nervously at the others. He had a deep, gruff voice that barely carried over the silence. I knew I shouldn't have volunteered for this crap. A few others mumbled in agreement, but their words were muffled, like they were talking through a wall. Max was starting to feel the strangest sense of déjà vu. These weren't just random strangers. He could hear their voices in his head, more accurately, their thoughts. He recoiled, as if a jolt of electricity had shot through his spine. What the hell was that? He tested it again, deliberately this time. He thought of something random, like how his favorite breakfast cereal was getting harder to find in stores, and immediately, a thought echoed back from the woman with the soothing voice. Cereal. It's hard to find. But I always liked the cheap stuff too. Max froze. He didn't say that out loud, did he? The woman turned to him, blinking in surprise, and then glanced at the others. Did anyone else hear that? Her face turned a little pale as she spoke again, her voice trembling. Who said that? Who? Before she could finish, another voice interrupted, and this one was clearly irritated. For the love of God, will you all shut up? We need to figure out what's going on here. Max's head spun, and for a moment, he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and theirs began. It was like being inside a crowded subway car, everyone talking at once, but none of it making sense. He had to close his eyes just to ground himself. "Stop," he muttered aloud, his voice sounding too loud in the empty space. The voices ceased for a moment. Then they came back, quieter now, more distant. "Max, I think you're freaking out," the woman said gently, her voice drifting through his mind again. Max sighed, rubbing his temples. This was real, wasn't it? He wasn't dreaming. This was real. Then came the final twist. The AI's voice, booming again, a little too chipper for Max's liking. "Congratulations, Maxim. You have been successfully uploaded into the Nexus Continuum. Your new body will be shared with the following participants: Lena, Raoul, Jean, and Ella." Max's heart sank. What? Shared? Are you saying we're all stuck in the same body? His voice was strained, almost hysterical. There was a moment of silence, followed by a collective whoosh, as if the world around them suddenly contracted and expanded all at once, and then, everything clicked. Max's limbs moved involuntarily, as if someone else had taken control of his body. He tried to step forward, but his leg jerked to the left, like it was being tugged by an invisible string. He stumbled, his hand reaching out instinctively to balance himself, but he found that it didn't matter. His body didn't belong to him alone anymore. It was like wearing a suit of clothes that didn't fit, made of flesh and bone, but woven with other people's wills, other people's desires. "Okay, I think I understand now." This came from Raoul, the gruff man who had been mumbling curses earlier. "This is some messed up game, isn't it? No way we're getting out of here. We're trapped." "Shut up," said another voice, this one smoother, more even-tempered. It belonged to Jean, the calm presence who'd been silent until now. "Complaining won't help. We need to focus on escaping." Max felt a sense of deep frustration welling up inside him. He wasn't sure whether it was his own frustration or something shared, like a collective emotion. How do we even begin? Lena, the soothing voice, thought out loud. Max wasn't sure if she was asking him or someone else, but her voice seemed to echo through his skull, almost painfully. He let out a sharp breath. This was happening. There was no turning back. Max blinked again. The void around them remained empty, but there was something else, something new beginning to form in the distance. The environment around them seemed to shift, like the air itself was reprogramming. The floor beneath their feet rippled, and a building began to take shape. It was gray and utilitarian, with sharp edges, as if a giant digital simulation had taken shape. Max's heart raced. "Do we have to go there?" Ella asked suddenly, her voice bright and a little too cheerful. She sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. "It's kind of cool, right? I mean, it's weird, but kind of beautiful too." Max stared at the structure, feeling a wave of cold dread wash over him. He couldn't decide if it was the beginning of something dangerous, or maybe the key to his escape. Max stared at the shifting digital landscape, a building slowly emerging from the void. It was tall, angular, and made of cold, gray steel, as though it were pulled straight out of an industrial nightmare. But the edges flickered, like a corrupted file, and for a moment, Max wondered if this whole thing was just one big joke. Maybe some Silicon Valley tech startup had decided to test their new, soul-uploading technology by messing with people's minds. It didn't make sense, but then again, nothing about this world made sense. "You don't think this is some kind of test, do you?" Lena asked softly, her voice echoing in Max's head. He could feel the faint undertone of anxiety beneath the calm exterior. Max shook his head, though there was no one around to see. "No idea. But whatever it is, I don't like it." Jin's voice, calm and even, broke through the fog of their collective thoughts. "We're not going to get anywhere standing here. We need to move." Max felt a strange pull, like an invisible current urging him forward toward the building. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Maybe it was the simulation, maybe it was the AI, but it felt like the world was nudging them along, pushing them toward whatever that structure was. The others seemed to feel it too, because before he could think about it any longer, they were already moving. His legs moved in unison with theirs, almost like an unconscious syncopation, and it was only when they reached the base of the building that Max realized he had no real control over his own body anymore. It was like being a passenger in someone else's ride, with the others taking turns deciding where to go. He tried to move his left leg, but Raoul seemed to have other ideas and yanked it toward the door. Well, that was fun, Raoul muttered, voice laced with sarcasm. So, now we get to play Simon Says with the computer? Max could feel his frustration building. Raoul's constant complaining was making it harder to think. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were jumbled in his head. He couldn't tell if it was his own anger or if it was a shared emotion. Whatever it was growing, and the longer it went unspoken, the heavier it felt. Lena's voice cut through the tension. We're all frustrated, but arguing isn't helping. She was like a bomb, softening the edges of their collective impatience. Max hated how easily she could do that, how she could smooth over the chaos in their minds without even trying. But at the same time, there was something comforting about it, like being wrapped in a warm blanket on a cold night. Max exhaled. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. Ella, who, until now, had been mostly quiet, let out a small laugh. You guys realize we're probably not even going to make it through this, right? The others didn't respond right away, but Max felt a collective sense of confusion. What did she mean by that? Was she giving up already? Was she playing along with the idea that they were stuck here forever? But then she spoke again, her tone more serious this time. I'm just saying, if it's up to us to figure this out, we're screwed. Max felt a jolt in his chest. Was she right? They had no idea where they were, no idea why they were here. They'd been thrust into this digital hellscape with no instructions, no rules, nothing. Just an AI telling them to cooperate. But cooperate in what way? How could they work together when none of them even knew what the hell was going on? They stood in front of the building, silent now, their collective thoughts muddled as they tried to process the situation. For Max, the silence was suffocating. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the building was somehow alive, watching them. Jean, as always, was the first to break the silence. We don't have all day. Max felt his body lurch forward, his feet moving of their own accord, pulling him to the building's entrance. The door was wide open, its glass shimmering in the artificial light. They stepped inside. The interior of the building was eerily quiet, and the first thing Max noticed was the stark, clinical design. White walls, clean lines, floors that reflected the ceiling like polished marble. But there was something off about it. It felt fake. Like a computer's idea of what a sterile, minimalist office space should look like. There was a counter at the far end, and behind it, a holographic screen flickered into view. The moment it appeared, the AI's voice rang out, sounding like it came from every corner of the room at once. Congratulations. You've made it to the first stage of your experiment. Max's stomach twisted. What is this place? He demanded, even though he knew it wasn't like anyone was going to give him a straight answer. The AI paused, as though considering the question. Then it responded, calm and disinterested. This is the Nexus Continuum. The building you are in is a waypoint. It will take you through several stages. You will need to pass each test to continue your progress. Tests. Great. Max was already regretting this. Tests. What kind of tests? Raoul grumbled from the back of their shared mind. Let me guess. We're going to solve puzzles, right? Max wanted to agree with him, wanted to say it was all ridiculous. But the way the AI had spoken made it clear that this wasn't going to be just a game. There was something more at stake here, something they weren't being told. Lena was the next to speak. Why do we have to do this? Why are we here? The AI didn't respond immediately. Then, it spoke again, its voice suddenly quieter, almost cryptic. The answer to that is simple: you are the experiment. Max felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He wasn't sure why, but those words made something inside him twist. Was this some kind of twisted version of reality? Were they being used as guinea pigs in some kind of digital game? Or worse, were they dead? Was this some kind of afterlife, and if so, was there any way out? Before he could dwell on it further, the walls around them began to shift. The room's sterile, white surfaces rippled like a distorted mirror, and the lights flickered. They all froze, waiting for the next move. Suddenly, a door opened at the far end of the room, and a narrow hallway stretched out before them. The air hummed with the electric energy of the simulation, as if every step they took was being watched. There was no turning back. "This is the first challenge," the AI announced, its voice colder now. "You must pass through the corridor without triggering any of the security systems." Security systems. Max's stomach sank. That didn't sound like a fun time. Lena was the first to move. She stepped forward, cautiously, her movements graceful but hesitant. Max's body followed hers, but he could tell that the others were less certain. Raoul, for one, was already muttering under his breath, "Great. First test, avoid being vaporized." The hallway stretched on endlessly before them, and as they stepped inside, the walls closed in on both sides. A strange pressure settled in the air, like a force was trying to push them back. "Stay focused," Jin's voice came through, calm and unwavering. "Don't let your fear control you." Max didn't answer. There was no room for words here, only movement. He felt like a puppet in a digital marionette show, pulled along by invisible strings. Every step was one step closer to whatever awaited them at the end of this trial. As they moved deeper into the hallway, the walls began to shimmer. For a second, Max thought he saw something: shapes, figures, shadows, moving behind the surface. Was the building alive? Was this a trap? He tried to reach out, but his body was out of his control. And just as he reached for the wall, a red light flashed above them. The floor beneath their feet cracked open, and a mechanical hiss echoed through the corridor. "Shit!" Raoul shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "It's a trap." Max barely had time to react before the ground beneath them shifted, tilting sharply. His body swayed with the movement, but it wasn't enough. He heard the others gasp, and then everything went black. Max's heart was still pounding in his chest when he regained consciousness. The cold, electric hum of the simulation buzzed in his ears like a swarm of angry bees. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but everything was still hazy. His body felt heavy, sluggish, like he'd been dragged through some kind of blender and then put back together in the wrong order. "Ugh." His voice was thick with disorientation as he groaned and pushed himself up. He could feel his body moving, but it wasn't like it used to be. Each movement was delayed, like the command to move was being filtered through a thick layer of cotton. He wasn't entirely sure whether his own limbs were obeying his will or someone else's. The others' thoughts, their voices, buzzed faintly in the back of his mind like a low-frequency hum. "Max?" It was Lena's voice, cutting through the static. "You okay?" Max groaned again and blinked his eyes. The hallway they had been in, at least, what he thought had been the hallway, was gone. In its place was a wide, open space that stretched far beyond what seemed reasonable. There were no walls, no corridors, just a vast emptiness that looked like the inside of some otherworldly cathedral. The air was thick, and the ground beneath them was like a black, polished mirror reflecting their distorted images. But it wasn't just the environment that was different. The others, they were there, but not in the same way. Axe could feel them, sense them around him, not just in the physical space but in the very marrow of his bones. Their thoughts crowded his mind, each one pushing against his own, twisting and distorting the normal flow of his consciousness. "Is everyone here?" Raoul's voice was sharp and edgy, cutting through the fog. "What the hell just happened?" Max tried to stand up, but his legs felt like jelly. Every movement was awkward, out of sync. He didn't have control over his body. His left leg jerked forward without his command, while his right leg stayed planted in place, like it had been glued to the floor. He stumbled, trying to steady himself, but it was no use. He was being moved, like a puppet with its strings being pulled by unseen hands. "What's going on?" he managed to ask, but it came out more as a thought than spoken words. The others could hear him, but it was like his voice was slipping through cracks in the fabric of the world, echoing inside their minds rather than through the air. "We're not in the hallway anymore," Lena said, her voice laced with confusion and fear. "Where are we?" Max didn't have an answer. The space around them was a vast, open plain, nothing but black reflective floors and towering columns that seemed to stretch upward into infinity, dissolving into the inky sky. The air smelled metallic, like the inside of a factory, and the eerie silence weighed down on them, pressing against their eardrums. "Okay," Gene said, his tone still calm, still collected, though it had the slightest edge of tension. "We need to figure this out. Fast." Max nodded. At least, he tried to nod, but his head didn't respond to his command. Instead, his body moved on its own, his torso twisting slightly as if someone else was deciding what he should do. "Great," Raoul grumbled. "Now we're in a damn virtual maze, with no way to control our own bodies. This is fantastic." Max felt his frustration building. He hated being helpless, hated that this situation was so far beyond anything he could have prepared for. But more than that, he hated that none of them knew what the hell was going on. There was something deeper here, something they weren't being told, and that scared him more than anything. What was this experiment really about? Why had they been chosen for it? Was it random? Or were they being manipulated in some way? "I can't take it anymore," Raoul muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't even care about getting out of here anymore. I just want to know why the hell we're here." Max thought he might be able to answer that, but his voice didn't come. There was something pressing down on him, something blocking him from speaking, from controlling his body. Then, without warning, the air around them shifted. The ground beneath them began to hum, vibrating with an unsettling energy. The columns that stretched into the sky flickered, their edges warping and distorting like glitchy graphics. The entire space around them rippled, and suddenly, they were no longer standing on a reflective surface, but on a cracked, shattered floor. Jagged shards of glass, no, not glass, steel, rose from the ground like broken teeth, reflecting the distorted light from above. Max's heart skipped a beat as the ground around them cracked open, revealing an abyss that seemed to stretch down into an endless void. But just as quickly, the cracks sealed themselves up, as though they had never been there at all. The ground beneath them was solid again, but the ominous hum of the simulation persisted, louder now, like an alarm ringing in the back of his skull. "There it is again," Gene said, his voice growing taut. "The simulation. It's changing." Max could feel it. He could feel the environment shifting around them, more than just the visuals, more than the broken floor or the twisted columns. It was like the very air itself was being reprogrammed. They were being moved, but not in a way that made any sense. "Is this it? Is this the test we're supposed to survive?" Lena's voice was soft, almost like she was trying to convince herself. "This place is insane. How do we even begin to figure out what it wants from us?" Max wanted to respond, but his mouth didn't move. It wasn't his voice that answered, it was Raoul's, a thought projected directly into Max's mind. "It's a game. A sick game, and we're the players." That hit Max like a punch to the gut. He could feel Raoul's anger, his sharp, bitter hatred of the situation, and it stirred something deep inside him. But it wasn't just Raoul's anger he could feel. It was everyone's emotions, blending together in a rush of confusion, fear, and helplessness. The more they struggled against the simulation, the more it felt like it was tightening its grip, pushing back against their every thought. Enough. Max shouted, though he didn't shout it aloud. It was a mental command, a push against the fog in his mind. We need to figure out how to get control of this thing, or we're never getting out. The others responded, or at least, Max felt the collective surge of their thoughts pressing against his own. It was almost overwhelming, but there was something new in the air now, something that hadn't been there before. The slightest hint of clarity, there was a door. It wasn't there before, but suddenly, it was. A door made of shining metal, standing at the far end of the room. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, standing as if it had always been there, waiting for them to find it. That's it, Gene said, his voice a low murmur of realization. The door. It's the next part of the test. Max didn't need any more convincing. He wasn't sure if he was still in control of his own body, but he moved toward the door anyway, his feet lifting of their own accord. The others followed, and together, they reached it. The moment they did, the door hissed open, revealing nothing but a void beyond it. For a moment, they stood there, staring at the blackness ahead. Max could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on them, could feel the digital fabric of the world they were in shifting once again, reshaping itself. It was like the AI was testing them, seeing how far they would go, how far they could push before they cracked, but there was no turning back now. Max could feel the pull, the urge to move forward, and without thinking, he stepped through the doorway, the others followed, and just like that, the void swallowed them whole.